Welcome to this NCVO webinar, Getting Ready for GDPR, Day 1 and Beyond. So my name is Gary Shipsey. I'm Managing Director of Protecture. I will be running through the webinar with you today. Alongside me is Paul Simpson from NCVO, who will be coordinating the polls and the questions. So please do submit your questions anytime throughout the webinar. We have many questions in advance. We will try and deal with as many as possible in the question and answer session at the end of the main presentation. A recording of this will also be available after the webinar has concluded. So, without further ado, let's look at the GDPR. And I suppose the first thing to say, to offer, hopefully by means of reassurance, is that a lot of the requirements in the GDPR are similar to the current Data Protection Act. So it is a principle-based piece of law. It does not tell you precisely what to do. It gives you a guiding set of principles that you have to understand and interpret and apply for your organization, for your size, for the resources you have available, for the level of risk you're willing to take. So that's reassuring that it's still about managing risk. It's still about taking proportionate decisions, and the guiding principles are not fundamentally changing. Having appropriate security, being fair and lawful, having accurate data, those things aren't changing because they are guiding principles that you can hardly argue with. The key definitions are not really changing. They're being clarified, and we'll look at consent particularly a bit later on. But the core definitions are by and large very similar to what we have now. The key differences are about the level of accountability that we have to be able to demonstrate when it comes to handling personal information. So that's both accountability within your organization, going beyond saying, well, that the trustees are accountable or the chief executive is accountable. Which different roles within your organization are also accountable for different aspects of data protection, whether it's procurement or in IT or privacy notices or handling breaches or handling requests for subject access. Who is accountable for those different aspects of compliance when it comes to GDPR? Similarly with transparency, actually to be genuinely transparent with individuals, first we have to know an awful lot of information about what we are doing with their data. What purposes are we collecting it for? On what lawful basis can we justify doing things with their information? Who do we share it with, both internally and externally? How long do we keep it for? What do we do with it when it's no longer of use to us? So we need to know that detail to enable us to be genuinely transparent with individuals. And these are the things that are going to change once we get into the new regime being in place. So on the Monday after the 25th of May, the expectations are going to only grow to be accountable, to have this level of detailed knowledge about what you're doing with information. Yes, the fines are going up, but the issue is more about trust and reputation. People believing that you know what you're doing with their information, you value it, and can give them answers to the questions they may ask as the new law comes into force. What it's about being able to do is say, well, this is what the current law says. We are responsible, you are responsible for compliance with the principles. That doesn't change on the 25th of May. What changes is the ability to be able to prove how you are doing that. So going beyond saying we are compliant, because everybody says they're compliant, of course we all say we are compliant. The issue has always been when push comes to shove, when something happens and we have to try and evidence and demonstrate how we are compliant, why it's fair, why we believe it's a fair processing of someone's data, why we deem this to be an appropriate level of security. That's always where the difficulty has been, being able to evidence it. The GDPR says, well, it shouldn't be a difficulty. It should be available. That level of detail should be available at any point. And the 5 words it adds in there into the accountability principle are critical. What it's saying is we're not just responsible for compliance, we're responsible for being able to demonstrate compliance at any point. This is where accountability really becomes important. This is saying, well, look, we know we might have a nominated data protection lead. Hopefully you've got someone doing that now, whether it's a data protection officer, and we'll look at what that is in a moment. But this is a question for yourselves at the moment. If you could participate in this poll, if you look beyond that lead person who's been nominated to make data protection happen or compliance happen, are there other roles and responsibilities and accountabilities well understood, documented, defined across your organization? Do you believe that this is not just understood, not just documented, but actually is it as far as being in people's job descriptions? This is what they are employed to do. This is the role they fulfill for your organization. So if you could please participate in the poll, we'll see what your sense is out there. And it's an interesting question because often it's seen as we need to get someone to do data protection. And yes, someone might lead on it, but actually one person alone is going to struggle to do this in whatever size of organization. It's going to need the input and the oversight and management of various roles and functions. So thank you for participating in that poll. We'll see what sort of figures we've got. And it's an interesting mix, actually. We've got a mixture between not well defined or understood and understood to a degree. But if we look at it being understood and documented, it's a lower, much lower percentage. And this is, in a way, is what I certainly would expect. And it demonstrates what the GDPR is trying to do. It's saying, well, actually, we need that increased accountability. So yes, certain organizations have to, by law, under the GDPR, appoint a legally defined role of a data protection officer. Now, this is public bodies have to do that. Organizations where the core of what they do with information is the large-scale systematic monitoring of individuals, so Google and Facebook. The only time that charities might be caught within this is in the third category, where charities, if their core activity is the large-scale handling of sensitive information, so medical information, religious belief data, that sort of thing, potentially they could fall into that third category. The problem we have is that the definition of large scale is not very well defined at all at the moment. There isn't clarity around what large scale does mean. But we need to be, certainly at the moment, at least mindful of what it does mean to appoint a DPO. And it's quite an undertaking for an employer to have to appoint a data protection officer. They have to report to the highest level of management. They have to operate independently. And the employer is committing that they will have adequate resources to do their job. It can be an internal existing employee, but if there is no conflict of interest, they can genuinely act independently, and that's quite a tricky area. So it being the head of IT or the head of procurement isn't going to work. The head of HR, because they, for part, will be marking their own homework. So the independence is a real interesting issue to work through. But actually, we don't want to get too hung up on whether we do or don't need to appoint a DPO, because actually it's about, as I said, the wider accountability. Who within these different services might be accountable for different aspects of managing and looking after personal data. Who might pull it all together, whether it's a certain defined role as a DPO or a role that you have created to make this happen. What are the accountabilities that all staff have and volunteers? Where's the accountability when it comes to your suppliers and those who you might have partnerships with? So real, genuine accountability means getting to that level of detail. And for nothing else, documenting your internal assessment and position on the DPO role if there is some debate. If you choose to appoint a DPO, do recognise you are committing to the same requirements as if you were mandated to appoint a DPO. You can't choose to appoint a DPO but not do some aspects of it. And therefore, if you're going to have to look at other routes. If you're not going to appoint a DPO, call them something different so it's distinctive and there's no confusion over their role and their status. But accountability, detailed accountability from all the different aspects that GDPR touches upon is going to be important as the law beds in and becomes a reality to your day-to-day handling of information. And we at Protecture see it as sort of three different levels of accountability. You've got the strategic accountability, sort of trustee level, senior management level maybe. You've got the operational ownership, someone who drafts and updates the policies and procedures and makes sure they're happening and can report on them. And then you've got the sort of tactical delivery, the nuts and bolts of who does what when a certain process or activity is required. So that level of accountability at sort of more at the coalface. So having that detailed accountability is going to be critical. What's also going to be critical as we move into the law being in place is having your record of processing activity. Now, we see this as a key document, certainly for organisations with over 250 staff, it's required by the GDPR. We think it's a core document for everyone because what it is, it gives you an overview of why do you collect and process information? What are the purposes for which you process data, personal data? On what lawful basis? How long do you retain it? And this information is not just useful to pull together, it should be a live thing that you update and engage with to deal with the requests and queries that come in from individuals. So when someone says, I want to withdraw my consent, you should be able to look at your record of processing activity and look at the purposes which rely on consent and which don't. It will also aid your transparency, meet your transparency obligations, because you'll be able to look at it and say, well, this is what we want to collect data for and on what basis. We can then convey that to people. We can be transparent because we know the detail and we're consistent in what we're doing with their information and how we get it across to them. It also will enable you to have a fairly detailed level, a real sense of the nature, scope, context and purposes for processing. And those terms are often come up again and again in GDPR, because actually knowing the nature, scope, context and purpose enables you to really deliver compliance in a risk-based manner, because you'll be making informed decisions based on the volume of information, what it is, in what context it is being held, for what reasons are you using it. That's particularly important when it comes to proactive management of personal data. So building in privacy-friendly features into new products, new forms, procurements, understanding the information and deciding whether you actually need to do a more formal impact assessment. Does it meet the criteria for having to complete one of those? And when it comes to information security, what is appropriate security will very much depend on what information you are handling, in what context, in what volume. So having this information in your record of processing activity is going to be a really important way to manage GDPR as it beds in, as it becomes a day-to-day reality. Because purpose is critical, absolutely critical to managing this. Current law and the GDPR says we can collect information for many, many, many purposes, so long as they are specific, explicit and legitimate. We know precisely why we are collecting information, because once we are clear on the purposes, we can think, well, how much information do we need to meet that purpose? In delivering and using data for that purpose, who needs to see it internally? Who do we share it with externally? How long do we keep it for? Is there children's data? Is there vulnerable adult data? And then on what lawful basis will we be justifying our processing of that data? Is it their consent? Is it a legal requirement? It's not whether they agree or not, it's the legal requirement. We have to collect and use this data. Is it a contractual relationship? Is it in our legitimate interest? This will make a big difference to what rights people have and how much control they have or not over their information. And once we're clear on purpose and lawful basis, we can be genuinely transparent. We can inform and tell people who we are, what we want to do, whether they have choice or not, and what's happening to their information. So if accountability is about understanding that detail, we can then be transparent. And the question we're often asked at the moment is, well, what do I need to tweak in my privacy policy to be ready for GDPR? And we can understand why people are looking at it in that way, but actually I think it's a bit more than that. And maybe this poll will help tease that out. So yes, looking at privacy policies and refreshing them and reviewing the level of detail in them is important. But have you actually done that recently? And if you have, is what you've ended up with something that's very long and detailed, but actually it's still quite vague and generalized? It says we may do this with your information. It may be this, it could be this. Or actually, is the way you're going about it quite specific? You're looking at different uses of data for different audiences, recognizing that what a donor needs to know is different to what a service user needs to know, is different to what an employee or a volunteer needs to know. There'll be different lawful basis, different data. So actually realizing that we can really think about how we're getting across the long list of privacy information that the GDPR requires. So thank you for, please do participate in the poll that should be in front of you. And we'll see what sort of responses we get. So let's have a look. So, okay, that's really interesting. So 2/3 of people said they've not really looked at it recently. So in a way, you've got a good opportunity to now to think about privacy information. Is the privacy policy the way to go to get across what is a long list of information that the GDPR says we've got to get across? Now, this guidance here from the Working Party that looked at transparency and what it means under GDPR, I think is quite enlightening. And it's saying we've got to really put the individual at the center of this and think of it in our own day-to-day lives. You know, when we are presented with a 10-page privacy policy and said, well, do you understand, do you accept? When we're pushed to a privacy policy on our website and say, well, that's what we're doing, does it look quite legalistic? Is it almost trying to seem like it's a contract and covering the organization for what it's doing? And this is saying, well, we should really move away from that. The whole point of privacy information is to convey who you are and engage people. Yes, there's a long list of information requirements that you have to get across, and they're outlined in the GDPR in Articles 12 to 14. But as important as ticking the box to show that you've covered off all these issues is actually the accessibility. Is that information understood? Can people approach it? Is it the right quality? Is it comprehensible to the audience that is approaching it? And we really think that's Protector, that's going to be an area where there's going to be a lot of debate and a lot of discussion around being fair and transparent. And the ICO has already sort of hinted at this in their privacy code of practice, when they're saying, well, let's step back from thinking we have to have a notice or a policy. Let's look at privacy information in the round and recognize we've got a bit of a tension. We have to be more detailed and specific under the GDPR, but we also have to make the notices understandable and accessible. There is a tension there, more detail, but more understandable. But thinking about the audience, I think is absolutely critical. As I've said, what a donor needs to know is different to what a service user or a member of staff needs to know when it comes to how their information will be handled. And certainly, you know, not seeing this as a legal exercise that we've got to cover ourselves with all this information, but starting to think about it as a communication piece. How do we convey who we are and what we want to do? And the ICO is saying you have discretion for when and how you convey the long list of privacy information that the GDPR requires us to get across. We think there are a number of ways we can do this. You know, having a strategy that says, actually, as a strategic choice, are we going to make some decisions on how we convey information? You know, what language will we use? Will we actually make a deliberate choice to reflect how we get across information depending on how information comes to us? So if lots of our audience engages with us in postal forms, putting a lot of privacy information on our website might not be the right way to convey it. If we engage with children or vulnerable adults, we should probably commit to making sure the language reflects the audience that we're engaging with. Then there's some general privacy information that all people should get, whoever they are. primarily the rights that they have and how they can raise concerns or object. So how are you going to get across that general information? Is it a static page on your website? Is it a leaflet that anyone can access? Is it a set bit of text that anyone would be told if they were ringing into your call center? Having established these as a sort of core strategy, then it's looking at individual baseline of information. So for each data subject, donors, service users, is there a core set of information that we can document? So this is the kind of privacy information approach, but breaking it down into data subject categories. Once that information, so it takes a bit of time to pull that together, once that's in place, then you can make individual assessments for each new or current form, whether it's a paper form, a web form, a point of collection, and then say, actually, how does that form stand up against the strategic choices and the baseline information that we have put together? So if information is being collected from an individual directly, via a form, in person, which is the information that's critical to know from that baseline information? What do they need to know up front when they're providing their personal data, and what might be put elsewhere because we believe they know it and it's general, and we're happy that it's fair for them to be able to find it elsewhere and not be told it up front? What about when we get data from other sources? How do we get across the privacy information? So the GDPR is clear if data is coming from indirectly, so you're getting it as a referral from another agency, or you're pulling in public personal information. How do you convey privacy information so the person is informed that you now have their information? Again, making judgments about what's the things they really need to know, and actually what might be the things that the referring body has told them, or that LinkedIn told them when they signed up. Understanding that detail. And then finally, if you've got existing information but you want to use it for a new purpose, you've assessed the compatibility, which is a separate assessment, but if you deem it to be compatible, then how do you convey that to the individual? How do you explain to them that we've made this assessment and we're going to now use your data for this? So we think this is the way that it can really work going forward. It won't be ready for the 25th of May, but to us at Protecture, this is the detailed way of getting to the point where you can say that we believe this is a fair collection of data. We are being transparent. And here's the rationale for why. We understand why we believe we are being fair and transparent. We're surprised that you're surprised what we're doing with your information, because we have an understanding of how we went about conveying the privacy information to you. So transparency is key. Getting some clear processes in place for these key aspects is also going to be important from day one. So mandatory breach reporting is new. At the moment, you've got no legal requirement to have to tell the Information Commissioner's Office about a breach. You're encouraged to. It's certainly best practice, and it's certainly becoming the norm for many sectors, but legally there's no compulsion. Now that changes on the 25th of May. If certain criteria are met, you will have 3 days to tell the Information Commissioner about a breach, and potentially, if certain other criteria are met, tell the individuals affected directly themselves. So quite clearly, this requires training and awareness amongst staff and volunteers about what a breach looks like, how to report it, that clear process for how breaches are supposed to be reported and escalated internally, and real clarity on who makes the decisions on whether to report to the ICO or the individuals. That there's clear accountability for making that assessment and reporting or not, making that judgment. So getting in place the policies and procedures around that is going to be critical from day one. So is looking at data protection by design and by default. So this is the concept of building in data protection and privacy-friendly settings and designs into systems, into procurement, into new activities right at the start. Not sort of thinking we must sign this off from a compliance point of view 2 weeks before we go live. Actually thinking, well, right at the start of this project, when we're thinking about the project team, the stakeholders, the budget, who's going to lead it, thinking, well, actually, what are the data protection issues and considerations at the start of this project? So the question from day one is, well, what are the touch points for for projects and things like that. Are you of a size and scale where actually there's a procurement team or a legal team or some touch points already? Might it be that they need to understand enough about this to recognize when there needs to be a full assessment of data protection? If you're a smaller organization and everything goes via the CEO, well, that person needs to have enough understanding of data protection by design to make sure that a new procurement of a system or a change in a system doesn't actually stop your ability to comply with the regulations beyond May. And finally, we're looking at consent, the question around what quality of consent have you got? Yes, there's a higher standard of consent when it comes to GDPR. The question is, have you already got that high standard of consent? Or have you got maybe a lesser quality of consent or more doubt? And therefore, we might need to re-permission the consent to get up to the standard that's out there with the GDPR. And there's a lot of discussion around methods and means of doing that, and maybe we'll have some questions on that after this presentation part. So finally, we just want to look at security, and we could do a whole webinar on security. The point to highlight here is that the requirements are not changing when it comes to GDPR. It's the same need to weigh up a lot of balanced considerations. So what is the state of the art? What is the standard for encryption or lockable cabinets and the cost of rolling out such a standard? What is the nature, scope, context, and purpose, which we will know from doing the previous work? What is the potential impact on individuals? So again, knowing, well, we've got certain sets of individuals where there is more vulnerability or greater vulnerability. But weighing up all those considerations, you've got to put in place appropriate technical and organizational measures. That's what the law says now. I said beyond May, it's having that detail on record to show we have considered these issues. That's how we came to our judgment. So if we're looking at sort of summing up some key steps to take away, this is Protecture's sort of foundation setting of foundation tools to work through. We've got a series of tools to say, well, look, you need to think about these issues and come up with your positions. So establishing whether you need to appoint a data protection officer, or certainly documenting the roles and responsibilities across the organization to manage data protection. Being clear about the resources you are committing to this, the level of resource, who is going to take this on at different aspects. What is your approach to training and awareness? That will enable you to say, well, look, we've got clarity, we've got engagement, here's the different accountabilities, here's how we're spreading the load when it comes to managing data protection. We then need to look at policies and procedures and guidance. And for us, it's about looking at what you've got at the moment and establishing, well, which of that is still good. There should be aspects of it that might need a bit of a tweak, but are still largely fit for purpose. Some you might just need to make a few changes. Some areas there will need to be new procedures and policies because it's a new aspect that wasn't in the current 1998 Act. But the outcome of that work should be a set of policies and procedures and guidance that enable you to deliver on the key requirements. Considering how you will monitor and report on compliance, both at an operational level and maybe a strategic level to the trustees. What do they want to know quarterly, 6 monthly on your handling of data? And having that understood is important. Similarly, having that confirmation of where the different levels of accountability are, strategically and operationally. So imagine you're trying to arrive at a document that you would hand to someone as a new starter on day one to say, well, look, here's who you need to speak to for these different issues if you have a question or query. And finally, it's about building that record of processing activity. Working with your colleagues to say, well, what are the purposes, the lawful basis, the retention? Let's try and get that documented and understood to give us a chance, a way of managing the requests and queries that are going to come into us, and to build our ability to be able to deal with data protection going forward when it comes to managing risk. So to us, that's our foundation level of service. There's more work that then follows, looking at the data journeys in detail for each of those purposes, building that privacy information strategy, knowing where the touch points are, what's the appropriate way of engaging with different audiences, knowing where data is stored, where the relationships are with third parties and suppliers and partners, and then looking at security, because once you've got knowledge of your information, you can start to make informed decisions and explain why you deem something to be an appropriate level of security. So that's how we approach sort of GDPR. We put it together in a policy framework. We've got a series of frameworks rather than templates. The risks with a template is that it short circuits the critical thinking. Rather, we've got a set of frameworks that say, well, look, here are the outcomes we're trying to achieve. How are you, for your organization, going to achieve them? You know, we can validate and give guidance, but actually it's for you to say, this is how we are going to deliver and meet the requirements of the GDPR. So I really hope that a very quick 30 minutes has been useful. I will have a look at the many questions that we have received. So it's great that there's so many questions and queries coming into us. Oh, many of them, yes. Okay. So let me try and answer as many as we can in the 15 minutes that we've got. So there's a question here about what is the difference between a privacy policy and a privacy notice. Well, essentially, the notice traditionally has been the fair processing statement, the thing that people see when they are filling in their or providing their personal information. So that's the place where you would put and convey the critical stuff that you believe people need to know to be informed and for your processing of their data to be fair. A policy has been traditionally the place where there's much more detail. Privacy policies have become a mixed bag of things. They've been a kind of cookie law compliance thing, telling people what cookies are, and more data information has been put in them to try and cover the sort of GDPR detail when it comes to processing personal data. As I said, I think it's about looking more broadly and saying, well, how are we going to convey the privacy information? Is it what goes in the notice? Are we going to use something on our acknowledgement? Are we going to have a video? Are we going to tell people, and where is the full detail? Might that be on a privacy policy? There's a question here about publicly available personal data, about whether you'll still be able to email people whose data you've got from public websites, such as counsellors. Essentially, yes, but as always, it depends. So what is the source of that information? Who are you engaging? And on what basis? For what purpose? So counsellors are individuals with a public profile fulfilling a public role who expect to be contacted in that work professional capacity. So if you're contacting them or using those public details for that purpose, then there should be very little trouble. If, however, you take that same public email address and put it in your general fundraising mailing list and treat that public information as a private citizen, then that's a bit different. That's not why it's there. That's not what it is there to be used for. That's not the expectation of the counsellor. So being very clear about purpose and what you're doing with the information is important. But if you're contacting a counsellor about their role as a professional counsellor, then that seems fine. Okay, what else have we got? Well, there's lots of questions here. So we've got questions about. Oh, there's another question there. A question that's an interesting one about verbal consent. Can we obtain consent verbally? So the short answer is yes. The GDPR makes reference to the fact that consent could be obtained electronically, or in writing, or verbally. I think the issue there is about having clarity on what record you're going to make, i.e., is it enough to say, well, look, we have a script, we know what was read to the person, script A was read on this date, and they agreed to it. Well, that level of record keeping for a verbal consent for fundraising, for something fairly innocuous, would seem about the right level of record keeping to me. If you were going to get verbal consent to conduct medical research on someone's data that could have a consequence for them, then you might want an audio recording of that consent, because we might be in court in 6 months' time and I might be challenging what I didn't agree to. So it does depend on what the consent is and what the agreement is for. But yes, potentially verbal agreement is a valid way of obtaining consent. It's an interesting question here about shared office space. So if an organization shares shared office space with another or many other organizations, and people can move around the office freely and potentially see information on people's desks or that's pinned up on the wall, what are the implications? I mean, in a way, that's an issue for now, regardless of the GDPR coming into play. The example here is saying that one charity is taking it upon themselves to put internal partition walls and have locks and security and internal doors that can be only opened by their staff. Well, they may be considering, having thought about what they do with information and what information they're handling, that is a sufficient, appropriate level of security given what they are handling. It all comes down to the nature of the information. That's really critical. If the data is fairly innocuous and it's the sensitivity isn't great, the volume isn't great, you might take a greater degree of risk. If the information you handle is very sensitive information on people's health, ethnicity, or something very sensitive or in very large volumes, then yes, you may need to take greater security steps in the shared office space. Okay, so there's a question here about whether the GDPR applies to very small groups. I mean, in a nutshell, yes. The GDPR applies to data controllers. Data controllers are entities that process personal data. The level of risk, the expectations upon very small entities that might be only 2 or 3 people or very small bodies are obviously different. But there are no sort of absolute exemptions from having to comply with the regulations. There are lots of exemptions if it's about personal use, domestic use, home use. Yes, if you're in your personal life have an address book, then 95% of the GDPR doesn't apply. But if you're doing it in any sort of professional or work capacity, like a residents association, when it's an entity, it's something that exists to fulfill a purpose, then it applies. It's about the level of expectation, I guess, when it comes to how that information is being handled. Okay, let's have a look what else we've got here. Okay, so how long have we got left? Oh, we've got quite a bit of time left. Okay, let's have a look at some other questions. So there's a question here about using legitimate interests as the lawful basis to cover activities. It says most of our activities. So the question is, well, what activities are you undertaking? So the example here is a newsletter, and whether a newsletter is considered marketing, direct marketing, or the activities of membership. And that is a very current and pertinent question. What do members, if you have members of a body and they're paying their subscriptions, what do they expect to receive for that membership? What is the benefit of being a member? What are they paying to receive? If they're paying to receive a quarterly newsletter and discounts at the shop or discounts to events, then so long you're making clear that becoming a member, that's what we're going to provide to you. There could be a technical debate around is that stuff direct marketing, but you're saying actually that's what you expect to receive as part of the membership, and we told you that's what we're going to send you. But being clear then, is there stuff that then falls out of the membership? Just something that might be outright direct marketing. So the example here is saying, well, would we need consent to send newsletters, flyers for meetings to non-members? Well, I think if you're emailing them, yes. If it's non-members and newsletters and flyers are promoting what you do, highlighting who you are, raising awareness of who you are, that is direct marketing, then you would need their consent to do that. the question around, they've been engaging for a while, we've given them a chance to unsubscribe, that doesn't mean you've got a record of their consent. A period of inactivity or inaction on their part cannot be taken to mean that they have positively indicated their consent. So the question of repermissioning will become an interesting question there. There is an issue, and it's a bit Kafkaesque, but you have to bear with me, about needing consent to seek updated consent. And that is true, just if you hold with me. So imagine if that rule wasn't in place, what would be happening is you would be inundated with emails from unknown organizations saying, hello, you don't know us, but would you like to consent to receive our newsletter and our marketing? Well, that very message in itself promotes that organization. You now know about that organization. They are in your inbox, even if their message is then saying, would you like to agree to receive further communications? So that's why using email needs consent in theory to seek better and updated consent. However, the practical sort of approach and the sort of the way that the fundraising regulator and in discussion with the ICO is to say, well, look, if you as a charity are confident that you have a relationship with these people, they are opening your newsletters, they are donating, they would know who you were if you did drop them an email. They wouldn't be surprised to receive an email from you seeking updated consent. Then the risk of someone turning round and complaining and saying, well, hang on, how did they even contact me, is very low. The risk of someone being upset about you saying, look, we're trying to improve and really be clear and get clear that we have your agreement beyond May to send communications to you. As long as you've done that assessment and you're not just going to fire out that message to everyone, you're not going to do what Flybe and Honda and Morrison's did, which was take a blanket approach and send out an email to everyone on their system, irrespective of whether those people had already opted out to receive indirect marketing, irrespective of how tenuous the relationship was. So with Honda, Honda Europe were messaging people when actually the individual had a relationship with the local dealership. So people were saying, well, how have Honda Europe got my details? Where's the relationship? I don't know who you are. So long as you're careful and consider who you're engaging with electronically to seek updated consent, then I think it's probably a degree of risk worth taking to try and improve and get clear GDPR standard consent ready for May and beyond. Okay, so let's have a look at probably one last question before we wrap up. I've got a couple of minutes left. Let me have a look at some of the later ones that came in. Well, it's quite a long list. Okay. So the question here about, are there any guidelines on what records we are able to keep once a new law comes into place? Well, again, there's technically no real difference between today and 26th of May. The record retention is driven by a mixture of statute, industry practice, and if those aren't there, then your argument as an organization as to why it is necessary to retain the information. So if you have a rationale, it all comes back to purpose. If there's a clear purpose in you needing to retain the information, and if that's statutory and it says you've got to keep the financial records for 7 years, then that's pretty clear. If there's no one figure, but there's clear criteria that define how long you might keep it for, then if you have that rationale, then you should be able to retain it because you have a clear basis. The example provided here about a medical charity, patients are calling in and you want to have continuity on their issues, it's useful to keep notes. Well, yes, so that's the question about how useful is useful. What level of detail do you need to retain to meet the purpose? And if the purpose is continuity of service, understanding someone's history, I can understand there's some rationale there. How far back you would go, how much detail you would keep, I think would be the key question to work through. And for medical information, why wouldn't you engage with a person and ask them to agree? Are they happy for you to retain it to fulfill that purpose, to give the continuity of service? Getting the person on board is the critical thing. So I'm sorry if we couldn't, there's so many questions here, we couldn't get through all of them, but I hope that's been a useful presentation and answer some of the more salient questions that seem to jump out at me. As I said, you'll be getting an email after the event with a link to Protect Your Services if you're interested, but also a link to the recording of the webinar. I really hope that's been useful, and thank you very much.